Good morning, everybody. My name is Justin Lincoln, and my pronouns are he, him. And please know that regardless of your age, gender, race, sexuality, sexual orientation, or your stance on bad puns, you are welcome here. And please welcome everybody on Zoom. Thank you for joining us, Zoom. While Reverend Ron is not here this morning, we have an extraordinary guest speaker. More on that in a few minutes. Our reading is a poem by David White called The Bell and the Blackbird. The sound of a bell still reverberating, or a blackbird calling from a corner of the field, asking you to wake into this life, or inviting you deeper into the one that waits. Either way takes courage. Either way wants you to be nothing but that self that is no self at all. Wants you to walk to the place where you find you already know how to give every last thing away. The approach that is also the meeting itself, without any meeting at all. That radiance you have always carried with you as you walk both alone and completely accompanied in friendship by every corner of the world, crying Alleluia. So our guest speaker this morning is Jessica Patterson. She's the owner and director of Root Center for Yoga and Sacred Studies. It's over on 17th and Uinta. There, she's a yoga therapist, applying the principles and practices of yoga to cultivate well-being within a therapeutic setting. I first met her in that capacity after having this yoga-related injury that a physical therapist recommended me to her for, and I've studied under her guidance in several settings since then. She's also currently pursuing a doctorate in religious studies in a program through the University of Denver and Iliff School of Theology. She's described her work as being, and I really appreciate this description, grounded in the intersection of embodied spiritual practice and social ecological justice. She draws from multiple sources of wisdom. Hey, that sounds familiar somehow. And I've always found her to have a knack for articulating really complex and elusive concepts.
Good morning. I'm so delighted to be here. I am Jessica Patterson. My pronouns are she, her. Welcome to All Souls, and welcome all souls. Let us set our collective intention today to gather together as community in the spirit of love and justice, to nurture and challenge ourselves, to seek truth, and put into action these intentions for a better world for all beings. In community, we find strength. In diversity, we find beauty. And in service, we find purpose. May we honor always that we stand on the unceded ancestral lands of diverse indigenous people whose ongoing presence and relationships remind us to remain humble and to be good stewards. In this area, this includes the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Shoshone, and the various Ute tribes. Let us extend gratitude too to that thread that weaves this world as one. I know. And give thanks to all those who have come before us, our ancestors and the ancestors of this land, and all the beings who make and are made by this land, including the living land herself. We offer warm welcome and thanks to all beings who help us hold sacred this time and space, those present within us, including the sensed and unsensed, and all those who will come after. Welcome.
So let's take a moment to honor the ancestors of this church. the people who first came together to create a home for liberal religion here in Colorado Springs, who worked to raise money for a building, who sat in committee meetings and created bylaws, who chopped and marinated and baked for potlucks, who painted and weeded and pounded nails and washed countless dishes, and who mowed the lawn like Dan did this morning, who gathered to worship, to learn, to grieve, to heal, to serve, to build justice, to transform their lives and this world. We are the recipients of an incredible gift and a beautiful vision. Let us do our part to keep this congregation strong, vital, and thriving for the generations to come. The morning offering will now be gratefully received. And in keeping with our calling, we are pleased to be able to partner with organizations whose values dovetail with our own. And this month, we are sharing the collection plate with the Unitarian Universalist Ministry for Earth. According to their mission, they are a seedbed for spiritual grounding and education that inspires deep practices of earth care, justice, and flourishing for all. Instructions for giving are on the screens behind me and in the chat on Zoom. And members, please indicate in the memo line, on your check, or on your envelope pledge, should you want the offering to go to your pledge.
My name is Rae Blaisdell. My pronouns are they, them, and today's story comes from Russia. The bird in the story is not in the original story, but can be found in Colorado. Including local birds is important to us when we are putting a bird on it, and interweaving other places and people's stories with our own. And I like to think of the birds added as something like an observer in many of the stories, like many of us, watching it unfold and sometimes interacting with it. As we tell and hear folklore and fiction, we invite the familiar and fantastical to intermingle. We find and make meaning of these and many other stories. We repeat the stories to invite familiarity, to cultivate individual and collective meanings, symbols, and values. And now for the story of Vasalisa the Wise. In a time that is long ago and now, there is a girl named Vasalisa. Her mother becomes ill, and on her deathbed, she gives Vasalisa a magical doll, imbued with love and blessings, and she says to her that the girl is to let no one ever see it. She is to feed and tell her troubles to the doll, and the doll will help her in whatever she needs. Sometime later, her father remarries to a wretched woman with 2 wretched daughters, who are so jealous of Vasalisa that they send her out to the lakes and woods to work hard in hopes that her beauty will fade and she might even be snatched up by Baba Yaga. But every day, Vasalisa feeds her doll, does her work, and finds her rest in the reeds and willows of the wetlands where she watches the blackbirds flit and dance among the stalks. The breeze is warm, but gold and red have crowned the tops of trees, and as she's left the wetlands, she hears the blackbird's pleas, a warning call, a burst of light from under one bird's wing. And as she walks up to the house, her stepsisters do spring. She knows her father's left them all to go to do some business, but unaware is she the ladies there have plotted mischief. Help us, sister, for the lights have all gone out. We haven't got a flame or coal to help us move about. We'll surely freeze and scrape our knees if you don't go beyond the row to go inquire for some fire from the hand of Baba Yaga. And this is how Vasalisa finds herself walking into the forest at night with the cold, dark house behind her, into that very forest where lives Baba Yaga. The old storytellers say she flies through the forest on her giant mortar with a pestle for a rudder, and even soldiers today say she flies overhead, dropping death and snatching them up in her claws, where she takes them home, she cooks them, she eats them, and she turns their bones into decor. As the birds are beginning to their dawn choruses, Vasalisa feeds her doll and asks for her help, because she surely will die in this forest. The doll responds, "Seek the light, my precious child. do what you can to know the wild. Together we will do the task, and soon this hardship too shall pass. It is then she notices a white rider moving through the forest with white skin, but also on a white horse and wearing white clothes. That's wild, she says, as the sun rises and she continues on her way. As the day is reaching its peak and she is noticing the comfort of her doll, Vasalisa sees yet another rider, this one with a red-hot face, flaming hair, a red horse, and red clothes. Now she is intrigued, and on she goes, deeper into the forest, until the darkness of night is coming upon her again. She sees again a rider, as she pauses on her way, clad in black, with a black horse and black skin, who rides towards a fence ahead, into which they disappear through what must be a gate. As they pass through, so too does the sun pass below the horizon. This fence is made of human bones, with skulls on its posts, whose eye sockets are burning so brightly that it is easy to see in this part of the forest despite the night, and the blackbirds are still singing. The girl stands at the gate. She swallows hard and pats her doll before she walks through the gate to where she can see the hut, which is standing on chicken feet, with a giant mortar sitting to the side. Vasalisa knocks on the door, and with a shuffle and a shriek, Baba Yaga swings open the door and smiles menacingly at the girl. Her hair is wild. She has a hooked nose and teeth that are sharp like iron fangs. "Oh, it's you. What do you want?" "Good evening, grandmother. I'm here because my family needs fire. Ours went out." "What a fool you were to let it go out. Come inside." "You will have to do the work I asked to get what you request. And if you don't, well, that's the thing that I would like the best. For then I get to cook you up and have a fresh dessert. So here's a list of all the things I really hope you shirk. First you'll make my supper, and then the house you'll sweep. And then you'll pluck the ergots from the pantry full of wheat. Do all this, and I won't eat you." Then Baba Yaga unceremoniously goes to sleep. Vasalisa sits by the fire, feeds her doll, and cries. "What am I going to do? There are so many bags of wheat. How am I going to take all the moldy kernels from them all?" "Seek the light, my precious child. Do what you can to know the wild. Together we will do the task, and soon this hardship too shall pass." Feeling the warmth of the fire and listening to the sounds of blackbirds in the night, Vasalisa sleeps. In the morning, she wakes and finds Baba Yaga has left the house and all the wheat already laid out on the mats with dozens of blackbirds flitting about, pulling the ergots from the kernels. Vasalisa is grateful and goes to work herself. That evening, she hears Baba Yaga flying through the trees with a gust of wind that shakes the earth. She walks gleefully to the hut, but when she sees the work completed, she scowls. And then she claps her hands and calls out, "My faithful servants, grind the wheat." And to Vasalisa's horror, 3 sets of hands appear from nowhere, just hands, and start grinding the wheat. And then she says, "You think you did a pretty job of doing all the work, but now you'll do it all again without another smirk. You'll find the poppy seeds within the earthen pile there. You'll sort them out and clean and cook, or else you should beware." And just as the night before, by the fire, Vasalisa feeds and speaks with her doll and laments the tasks ahead of her. How can she possibly separate poppy seeds from a pile of earth? Vasalisa holds her doll as she gazes into the fire, and she falls asleep again to the blackbird's songs. The next day is as the first, with the impossible work completed, and when Baba Yaga returns and finds them done, she sets the strange hands to work and asks slyly, "Do you have any questions for me, girl?" Vasalisa touches her doll and knows she must be careful with such a seemingly nice offer. So she asks about the 3 riders she saw on the journey there. "Ah, yes, these are my faithful servants. The white is my bright day, the red my midday sun, and the black my dark night. Do you have any more questions, girl?" "No, thank you, grandmother." That is wise of you. And now it's Baba's turn to ask, "How were you able to do the tasks, girl?" Vasalisa replies that it is her mother's loving blessing that allows her to do these things. "Ah, I cannot eat you with such a blessing. Here, take your fire and be gone." And with that, Baba Yaga takes a skull from the fence, puts it on a staff, and gives it to Vasalisa. When her sisters see her coming from the forest, they run towards her frenzied, telling her they have been without light all these days, that none could be lit within the house since they put it out, even when they tried to borrow some from the neighbors. She lights the hearth again, but it seems to her stepmother and stepsisters that the skull's eyes are following them wherever they go. And the next morning, Vasalisa wakes and finds nothing but ash remaining of the three who plotted for her death.
Vampires, werewolves, skinwalkers, a mortar and pestle flying child-eating witch ensconced in a chicken-legged house surrounded by a fence of human skulls and bones. I'm here today to share a little something, not on the theme of horror, although we might speak to the ways in which real monsters, within and without, can and do intrude upon our habitual comfort and jostle us out of the status quo. But rather on the theme of embodied healing, a subject that not only occupies most of my doctoral work and my work within the field of yoga, but also surpasses the strict boundaries of our usual thinking. That is, I cannot talk about embodied healing without first complicating and unraveling some of our most deeply entrenched and deeply seated assumptions about the terms and how exactly they direct or deflect, enable, include, preclude the lines we draw around self, in which bodies we are locating the idea of embodiment, and just what exactly we mean when we say healing. And none of these inquiries are separate from the questions about who and what we do or don't reckon as ancestors, as kindred. That's wild, we might echo Vasalisa. So please bear with me, it might get wild. We are drawing near Halloween, the origins of which come from the ancient Celtic festival known as Samhain, which marked a transition from the long days of summer and the harvest season to the cold, long days of winter. The Celts believed that on this threshold of what is understood as a new year, the boundaries between the worlds of the living and the dead grew porous, thin, and easily traversed, enabling the ancestors, or the Osha, the supernatural beings we sometimes call the Fae folk or the fairies, and diverse spirits of the other world to move freely among the earthly realm, and vice versa. Places were set for ancestors at the table and by the hearth to welcome the spirits of the dead. And myriad rituals were enacted with precision and care to acknowledge and not offend the etheric presence, because it was understood that they had real power in the lives of the living, whether they were seen or simply felt. And so Samhain feasts and celebrations sought to propitiate and honor the spirits seeking protection for the cold days ahead. And in the case of those earthly beings who crossed through the portals to the other world, the ask for wisdom, for vision, and divinatory power. And of course, in some regions, they wore masks and costumes. They turned their clothes inside out in the dark night, mumming and guising, done perhaps to hide themselves from potentially angry spirits, but also to explore the liminal space betwixt and between, impersonating the Osha and other spirits. And that sanctioned different kind of behaviors: mischief, tricks, pranks, but most importantly, play. This was and still is then a festival that celebrates and makes explicit the blurred boundaries of time, space, and identity, where then and there is present here and now, and the dividing lines between what is real and what is imagined grow fuzzy. Human storytelling has long had a fascination with the intersections of the human and the more than human world. There are countless folktales, myths, and legends about people who turn into animals and animals who can transform into humans. There are stories of humans who become insects and plants. There are stories of those who are turned to stones and bodies of water, planets, stars, and even pillars of salt. Greek and Roman lore is replete with divine interventions that blur the boundaries of the human and the more than human. Athena spitefully changes the weaver Arachne into a spider. Gaia transforms Daphne into a laurel tree to protect her. Niobe is condemned to be an eternally weeping rock, while Narcissus, obsessed with his own beauty, withers, but is transformed in the end to a flower. We have Loki in Norse mythology, the shapeshifter who's sometimes a god, sometimes a salmon, sometimes a mare of the horse kind, the horse mare. While the Tlingit people of the Pacific Northwest know Raven as a shapeshifter who is sometimes human, sometimes bird. The Ojibwa have the legend of Nanabush, both trickster and hero, transforming so easily into animals and plants. We have West African folklore that teaches of Anansi, the trickster and storyteller who's often a spider taking human form. And among the Yoruba, there are stories of trees holding the spirits of the ancestors and the gods, blurring the lines between human, divine, and other than human. There are the Selkies of the Scottish lore, these are my people, the seal people, who under the light of the moon may shed their sealskins and then turn into, or appear to be, human women. Don't worry, I'm real. They would dance on the beach and fool the fishermen and the sailors. And then, of course, there's the Morrigu, or the Morrigan, the Irish goddess of war and death, who is sometimes three sisters, sometimes a crow, sometimes a raven, sometimes a murder of crow, or sometimes a gathering of ravens, the formal name of which is unkindness, or my favorite, a conspiracy of ravens. As fascinating as all this may be, you may be wondering, what does this have to do with embodied healing? I told you it might get wild. Myths and legends about shapeshifters are most frequent among the cultures that have strong animistic traditions that see the spirit in all things. Across time and geography, what we encounter in these encounters are not just different imaginations and speculations, but different worldviews. The stories are breadcrumbs we can follow to revise not just what's imaginary, but what it is we take to be real. They can shape not just what we know, but how we come to know the world and what we do within it. Many of these stories point toward the imaginal in a way that can help illuminate something more real about what is here and now. And woven through so many of these wisdom traditions is an understanding that we must extend beyond our usual perceptions and projections on the world to engage with the imaginal, because without it, we aren't really engaging at the deepest level of reality. In fact, there are wisdom traditions that don't just tell these as stories, but actually teach adepts practices from which these stories emerge. More often than not, these are intensive trainings that teach you how to fix your gaze on a specific point without distraction, without even blinking, refining the concentration until all else grows quiet and everything fades into the background and it gets distilled down, and there's a dissolution of the sense that you are separate from the thing you are focusing on. This is a seminal teaching in the yogic traditions, which is essentially when you lock your attention on something, you will eventually, but inevitably, become that. And this is not just about what we focus on, but the quality of our focus. We need only look at what is happening in the world right now to get a sense of the consequences of that and the urgency to look at things differently. How we know the world, the methods and means through which we assume and enact knowledge making, are inextricably related to how we see the world, and both determine how we behave in it. This is echoed in the teachings of Abhinavagupta, the 10th to 11th century Kashmiri philosopher and theologian, who instructed that spiritual progress occurs only when three things are aligned: motive, the reason behind it; worldview, how we see things, how we construct the world; and the practices we do. What is it we're doing? If we practice in service of wrong motive, greed, jealousy, the belief that we are somehow broken and need fixing, or if the worldview we hold is in conflict with what we are actually practicing, for example, we will not make progress. Another way I like to share this is why we do something shapes how we do it. And how we do something is, in the end, what we've done. So today is really a talk about shape-shifting and boundary crossing. It's a call to action. It's a call to awareness, to the light, to accountability, to responsibility. It's an invitation to us all to revise, to see anew, and reconfigure our relationships with one another, with matter, and what it means to matter, with the practices of our lives, with our own bodies, with other and othered bodies, with time and space and our very identities. It's a lot. So I'd like to point out this is then not a reflection, which is what I was asked to do. It's a diffraction. And diffraction, as both a phenomenon and a methodology, is the reading of things through one another, not merely to compare or analogize two static objects against one another, thereby reifying each as separate, but rather to enable and reveal a novel pattern that emerges when the two come together. The way when two people come together, or we come together in any relationship, something new can emerge. This makes obvious the indeterminacy of our presumed boundaries. Boundaries between texts, stories, voices, realms, lands. Boundaries we take as real between time, between space, and between bodies. So yeah, right out of the gate, I'm doing something different, right? I was asked to give a reflection, and I told Justin it would be on embodied healing, but here I am diffracting and asking you to think about all this other stuff, like vampires and witches. But what I'm asking you to do is think less, actually, about all this and feel more, to sense into your own animal, human, communal body as we continue a bit further into the wild, to sense into and feel. Think less, my teacher would say, feel more. In academia, we have long-standing partitions and divisions among disciplines, including the deeply entrenched boundary we erect between what we call the humanities and the natural sciences, a division that perpetuates our belief that people are somehow set apart from nature. This is a wound we must tend to, and soon. Healing itself suggests a wound, an injury, some prior or ongoing harm. And this suggests, in turn, that one crucial step in healing is to acknowledge that there is a wound. Foundational to Buddhist thought are the Four Noble Truths outlined by the Buddha, whose name means the one who woke up. These are the truth of suffering, the truth that there is or are causes to suffering, the truth that there is therefore a way to end suffering, and the truth of the path to end the suffering. It's very logical and capitalized, like everything in Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths. The Eightfold Path that is given as the way to end suffering provides a framework of practice for embodied healing, for communal healing, for global healing. It includes things like right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right effort, right concentration. Seeing things as they really are and honestly acknowledging the pain that is part of the process. Under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, the man who was to become and transform into the Buddha is said to have put his right hand down to the earth and touched the earth as witness in the moment before his enlightenment. The earth bore witness. How do we acknowledge the wounds of this world with our own bodies, which yearn to heal injuries of the past and injuries of the present and minimize the harm we cause in the days ahead? We speak so often of healing from something, but what happens when we together consider what it is to heal into something? Might it challenge our imaginaries about just who it is we think we are and what we might do together? Do what you can to know the wild. We heard in the Vasalisa story. Do what we can to know the wild. Together we will do the task. It's as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel taught, indifference to evil is worse than evil itself, that in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And our responsibility then, our work today, and you will forgive me, I hope, for giving you work to do on so beautiful a day, but our collective work is through this diffraction of a few stories and musings to destabilize and problematize some of the most deeply embedded, often violent, embodied and enacted binaries. The dichotomies, literally to cut in two, including mind-body, physical-spiritual, material-spiritual, psychological-biological, personal-communal, emotional-rational, human-non-human, sentient-insentient, past-present, self and other. Materially enacted, meaning these ways of seeing and cutting up the world have material consequences. Consequences that are real and differentially distributed among bodies. These binaries frame how we perceive and respond to or react in the world in ways that repeatedly, consistently denigrates what falls on one side of the equation, negating the other side of the binary. So as the poet Mary Oliver offered, to pay attention, this is our endless and proper work. And it is this work I ask of myself and all of us here today, to tend to this world by making a practice of shifting how and from what place we are perceiving it. Because the ways in which we draw the lines truly matters. It determines what matters and what doesn't in very real ways. Let me give you an example. In January of 2017, Donald Trump authorized the construction of a wall that would cut across the ancestral lands of the Thano-Atham people, a people whose tribal name means desert people. For over 4,000 years, their traditional territory spanned across what we now call southern Arizona in the United States and the northern region of Sonora in Mexico. The Thano Atham have deep cultural and spiritual beliefs connected to the saguaro cactus, a keystone species of the Sonoran Desert. For them, the saguaro are sacred beings, keepers of memory. And according to some of the oral traditions, saguaro are thought to be transformed spirits of ancient ancestors, and thus are treated with respect and reverence. Their towering presence in the desert is viewed as a reminder of lineage, of kinship. Over the course of the last 2 centuries, the tribe has lost territory on both sides of what we now reckon as a national boundary. Mining, encroachment, railroad construction, and then a border wall. How the Thano Atham see and understand the desert is fundamentally different than that worldview that sees the land purely as resource and sees the desert as a void with nothing living in it. It takes 70 to 100 years for a saguaro to grow 1 arm. They can live to be 200 years or older. But as work began on the wall, remains of chopped up saguaro, a punishable crime in Arizona, were visible along a swath of the Sonoran Desert. And the Otham decried this as desecration of their ancestral lands, citing both environmental and archaeological violences committed in the act of building this wall. To erect this boundary, to draw this line, required a particular understanding of time, jettisoning historical presence and precedence, and a particular conception of space, again, seeing the desert as empty. And in both cases, construing something where bodies did not matter. They did not count. The saguaro, the Otham. The lines we draw matter. This border wall, however, is not an exceptional act of violence, and we must keep it in mind. It's just one more of the more recent assaults in a long, unbroken history of practices that are embodied and have stories that keep them in place. So I'm reminded here of the words of the mad farmer poet himself, Wendell Berry, who said, "There are no unsacred places. There are sacred places, and there are desecrated places." When a place, a space, has been desecrated, we tend to move toward it quietly, reverently. Consider, is there a place on this earth at this time that has not been desecrated? We are now in the woods, in the dark, together. And perhaps these diffractions, these readings of multiple stories through one another are evoking or awakening something in you, a sensation, an emotion, and a feeling. Let me remind you of the doll's guidance to Vasalisa: do what you can to see the wild. In a number of different interviews, Paul McCartney has said that the lyrics to the beloved song Blackbird were inspired by the civil rights movement of the United States in the 1960s. And the song was composed during a period of heightened racial tensions epitomized by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1968, a wound that was and is still fresh in people's minds and bodies. McCartney said that the blackbird with her broken wings learning to fly was his way to offer encouragement to Black Americans facing the violent, unrelenting, institutionalized oppression. He explained that the blackbird metaphor symbolized a Black woman in the midst of this struggle. And the lyrics, "You were only waiting for this moment to arise," suggests McCartney's message of hope and solidarity. But I want to note 2 other aspects of this lyrical call for social justice and resilience. because the moment of flight, the transition is into the light of a dark black night. And what arises in that moment is a power best understood through the more than human world, through a wounded blackbird. Do what you can to know the wild. Together, we will do the task. How do we move toward the shadows of ancestral pain, both inflicted and endured? We must be mentored in how to sense into the world more, not just think about it. We must grapple with the fact that our beliefs, as great as they can be, may also require embodied practices, brave actions that focus our attention differently. I often ask my students, who are you insisting on being at the expense of who you are really? Like the shape-shifting teachers across these traditions, we must cultivate different ways of seeing, listening, breathing. Breathing like we're breathing the fragrance of the world, tasting and savoring and feeling and being willing to be touched by the world around us as kindred, as relative, as part of us. Can we learn to be the animals we are before the humans we have become desecrate the whole world? Because the trick is, and this is also the treat, healing, like trauma, happens relationally. And though we are embedded in post-Enlightenment, late-stage capitalist, individualist ideologies, we are being brought to our knees right now by the devastation, mass extinction, violence, and denigration of the world around us. On our knees, we can give up, or on our knees, we can give in. Let the world in and give to the world something other than our habits. On our knees, we could learn to crawl again, reverently, humbly, with curiosity, like a precious earthworm who makes available the vitality of soil. Human thinking can't always save us. We need to relate to the more than human world, to know the wild, and sense into relationship and connection to other beings who may awaken in us supernatural powers. Could we make the case that Vasalisa was healed by her time with Baba Yaga? Baba Yaga, wild-haired, hook-nosed, terrifying, morally ambiguous, and most certainly living on the margins of what is known and normative, but also a shamanic trickster, a boundary crosser, transforming and transgressing. Let me diffract one more perspective for you. I want to share something about the Kapalika. The Sanskrit word Kapalika comes from Kapala, which means skull. And these were the skull bearers, or the ones who carried the skull, an ascetic Shaiva sect that flourished in India during the early medieval period. And they're often associated with these really extreme practices. But these are ancestors to later yoga traditions that we think of as quite tame. And they've been described as rejecting conventional social norms because they wandered among the creation grounds and carried skulls. Is this sounding familiar? They decorated themselves with bones and were associated with very specific behaviors, like going into public and shouting at people purposefully. But their actions weren't random. They were staged. They were part of a structured spiritual practice that aimed at playing with what was considered to be the norm in order to show how arbitrary some of these lines can be. Now, I'm not making an appeal for anyone here to act like a Kapalika, but I am considering the ways in which deliberate practice on the margins of the orderly might offer us yet another perspective. Because a lot of pretty murky, sketchy stuff is said about Baba Yaga, a name that also can mean grandmother. A mythology surrounds her that is used to terrify. But who are the real monsters in the end? The stepmother and the sisters, that unholy trinity trope, fuel their jealousy, their hatred, and their deception to get Vasalisa into Baba Yaga's clutches. But Baba Yaga is entirely honest with Vasalisa about the situation. Do the work, I ask. Do the work I ask, she says, or you get eaten. Right understanding. And that is as much a call to attention as it is anything, a less obvious teaching, perhaps, of the eight-limb path, but invaluable instruction when one is in the wilderness of life. Pay attention. Attend to things. Baba Yaga suggested a different kind of kinship and doesn't lie to Vasalisa. And because Vasalisa is likewise honest and brave and says exactly how she's getting things done, she is granted her freedom and the fire. She becomes a skull bearer. She is given the fire in a skull and becomes a keeper of the light. And fire is the very power of transformation. It breaks apart old molecular bonds and gives off light and heat, power. Vasalisa is sacrificed by her family to the fires of Baba Yaga, but she returns empowered and wise. The inversion, but she didn't get there alone. She got there through relationship to what appears inanimate, the doll, to the very real feeling of her fear, her own honest embodiment, and her willingness to learn from what is wild and untamed. The inversion of the Vasalisa Baba Yaga doll trinity is instructive. The familiar cottage with the stepmother and the sisters is where the real monsters were. Vasalisa moved toward what is scary, toward the shadows on the fringe, and she is granted, like those ancient Celts wandering into the otherworldly fairylands, wisdom. With Baba Yaga, our usual lenses are blurred, and we are brought betwixt and between, into the liminal, both and, not either or. We are descendants of and relatives to so many things. I think of the four-legged and scaled beings. We owe our very lives to the soil we pave over, the air into which we belch exhaust, and the waters in which we spill oil and blast sonar, disrupting communications, displacing and injuring sea beings like whales, dolphins. Are these not our relatives? To whom are we related? Because where we draw the line matters. Who are our ancestors and what kind of ancestors will we be? What if we begin with the possibility that the real locus of our spiritual work is not just our individual bodies, but our communal bodies? Because healing is, of course, not curing. But perhaps in our personal and collective healing of the monsters we have and sometimes become, we might enable a new kind of supernatural being. That's wild, Vasalisa notes. That's wild, we might agree. And so I will close this diffraction and ask that you all ease into the unknown for a bit while you digest some of this. Because I believe there are invaluable lessons for us in the stories of the shapeshifters. Lessons that can help us reconfigure and recognize our place in this world. A world where the demarcation between what's human and more than human is gossamer thin. As Thoreau wrote, not till we are lost, in other words, not till we have lost the world, do we begin to find ourselves and realize what we are and the infinite extent of our relations.